Now, why focus on children? What I try to convince you in this talk is that the children were one of the groups most affected by this change, by this migration to Israel. Children are naive, so sometimes you find statements by children that you don't find articulated by adults. For example, I found children complaining that they don't understand why they have to feel any connection to the state of Israel, to its flag, children crying that they want to go home, to Baghdad, to Basra, to other places. They represent sort of in-between cultures. They grew up in an Arab culture, they were uprooted, and then they came to live in an Israeli culture. They move between these locations, and children, as sort of someone whose minds are yet to be developed, are also targeted at this period by the Israeli state, who sort of gives up on the parents but want to educate these groups. And this talk is based on a few sources, work in Israeli archives, state archives, Zionist archives, memoirs, the press from this period in both Arabic and in Hebrew, by Knesset committees and discussions. So there are a lot of discussions in the Knesset, in the Israeli parliament, about the status of children. Pamphlets, mostly in Arabic, circulating amongst the Iraqi newcomers, and petitions, dozens and dozens of petitions sent to various governmental offices in Israel by newcomers from Iraq. So very generally, the Jewish community in Iraq numbered about 150,000 individuals. It was mostly a community whose members belonged to the upper middle classes and the middle classes, although there were poor Iraqi Jews, there were also rural Jews in the north, but the role amongst the middle classes was pronounced. For example, the family that brought Coca-Cola to Iraq, the agents of the Ford auto company, the major cinema owners were Jews. They also enjoyed quite a well-developed education system with bilingual schools in French and in English. In the late 1940s, Zionism becomes an important movement in Iraq. It's a minority movement. Less than 1% is attracted to it. Most people want to live in Iraq, but some of the youth is actually attracted to Zionism. Here's a letter from Margalit, an Iraqi girl who writes to her parents. She lives in the kibbutz. They want to migrate to Israel. And she writes to them, "I was surprised when I found out that you wish to go to America. Do you think Jews are better off there? If you think so, you are certainly in the wrong. Although it is quiet there now, anti-Semitism is rooted deep in the hearts. Wherever a Jew goes, he is a Jew. Who knows when will riots against the Jews of America begin? There are all sorts of phenomena in America that we, the Jews of Iraq, are familiar with and live through. Why should the Americans and the English not go after the Jews? Is it because they're people of culture and learning? The Germans were men of culture as well." So the idea in this post-Holocaust world that Zionists believed in, young Zionists, is that anti-Semitism is bound to happen or bound to appear in Iraq. And there's a much more complicated history for that, but for the sake of brevity, I will end here. Now, between 1948 and 1950, Iraqi Jews find themselves in a horrible situation. The Israeli state wants to get them. The Iraqi state or at least right-wing elements within the Iraqi state engage in a campaign where every Jew is a Zionist and therefore a traitor. And the members of the communities become pawns in the Arab-Israeli conflict. And they decide to leave en masse, to give up their Iraqi citizenship, and to go to Israel. A legislation passed retroactively freezes all their property. They were allowed to live with very few artifacts. And when they came to Israel, most of them realized that their bank accounts, their assets, their properties were all frozen. And in fact, they never saw them again. So the community was not only uprooted, but also all of a sudden became penniless. And they arrived to a state of Israel that had no resources to absorb them. Other Jews from other Arab countries also flocked the young state, Holocaust survivors, Jews from Egypt, later on from North Africa, from Yemen. They all arrived to the state between 48 to 56, even 58. The state doubles its population. And it's a very poor state that lost 1% of its population during the 1948 war. The Palestinians that remained live under a military regime. So this is not sort of a happy place, especially for the Iraqi Jews. The state decided after a few other experiments that since there is no money for housing, Iraqi Jews, together with other migrants from the Arab world, but also from Europe, from Romania, from Poland, would live in what is called transit camps, or ma'barot in Hebrew. So they would live in camps of tents, later on of tin shacks, of wooden shacks, close to cities, where they would eventually find some sort of a livelihood, and then after a few years, they would get enough money and leave them. Unfortunately, people stayed in these camps for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, some as long as 6 and 7. Now, whether North African Jews were actually sent to cities on the borders, Iraqi Jews stayed in these camps. And they found many, they faced many problems. One was the complete loss of a social status. And they came to a community that was socialist. In Cold War politics, Israel identified with the United States, but it was a socialist community, red flags, unions, very interventionist state, May 1st celebrations. And one of the sort of manifestations of this was that grown-ups were supposed to work, and many of them were sent to work in agriculture. Now, in Zionist ideology, working the land is extremely important. It has all sorts of mythical meanings connecting to the homeland. But for these Jews from Iraq and also from other Arab countries, this was a complete humiliation. Somebody who was a clerk or a merchant was now supposed to you know, plant trees in places that actually didn't need trees, or move stones from one place to the other. A more serious problem was their Arab culture. So this is a state whose elite was European, and an elite that fought against the Arab population of Palestine, the Palestinians. Now come Jews who knew French and English quite well, but also a population that enjoyed Arab music, Arab culture, Arab films, that spoke Arabic. And they were stuck in these camps with no funding from the state. The cities were close, but they were far from them because there were very few buses. They lacked Hebrew skills. The health and public services in the transit camps were atrocious, and we have complaints, mainly by doctors, to state ministries again and again, that you have to do something about the bathrooms in these facilities, that you have to do something about the fact that there is no doctor in these camps. The weather, especially the winters, was a problem, and there was a feeling that the state neglected them. There are popular songs sung by Iraqi Jews where they said, "What have you done, Ben Gurion? Why did you bring us here? Cursed be the black hour that brought us to this place." This is a famous quote written in 1949. This is a quote that was actually condemned by the Prime Minister of Israel, David Ben Gurion, at the time. And it shows you sort of racism in its kind of most crystallized fashion. This is mostly about North African Jews, but you can get the gist. We're dealing with people whose primitivism is at its peak, whose level of knowledge is one of virtually absolute ignorance, and worse, have little talent for understanding anything intellectual. Generally, they're only slightly better than the general level of the Arabs, Negroes, and Berbers in the same regions. In any case, they're at an even lower level than we have known with regards of the former Arabs of Israel. And there's a famous quote that is attributed to Ben Gurion from this period that also talks about the fact that we kicked out good Arabs and we brought in bad Jews. These Jews also lack roots in Judaism, as they're totally subordinated to savage and primitive instincts. As with the Africans, you will find among them gambling, drunkenness, and prostitution. So this is being said about the North Africans, but it's important to remember that for the European clerks, managers, people who dealt with the newcomers, the distinctions between North African, Egyptian, Iraqi, Kurdish, Persian were quite minimal. They didn't know the difference, and some of them didn't care. They were Jews who came from the Middle East. Yemen, Baghdad, Kurdistan, it's the same. So these are some images from the transit camps. You see 49, the tents. This is a line for food. These are again children in the transit camps when it was tents. This is a more progressed form of living. This is the tin houses. And this is a family actually from India, but one of the problems in these camps is that people, from Romania, from Iraq, middle-class people, upper middle-class people, people who didn't know how to read and write, were now all supposed to live together and somehow communicate with one another. The state intervened mostly or cared deeply about these camps when it was time for elections. So this is an election campaign, and it says sort of give livelihood. It's literally mean coverage or clothing to the transit camps. So what you see in Israel in the 1950s, and this is a phenomenon that hasn't been studied enough, is actually a lot of demonstrations in front of the building of the Jewish Agency, in front of government ministries, where people demand certain things. They want housing. They couldn't afford even a down payment for a wooden shack in the camps where they lived. They wanted employment based on skills. They wanted clean water, better sanitary conditions, and especially education. Now, I brought this quote to you just so you can understand sort of the trauma and the differences and the issue of race here. So this is a woman called Nuzhat Qassab. She's Iraqi Jewish. She migrates to Israel in 1949. And she talks about meeting her nephew for the first time. Her sister already lives in Israel. She wants to meet her nephew. I approached to kiss him, but he rejected me with some hate. Naturally, we had no common language. The little boy spoke only Hebrew. My brother-in-law apologized and said, "The kid thinks you are Arabs, and the Arabs killed here Jews during the war. Amongst them are friends and neighbors." The father in Hebrew, and we in our language, tried to explain to him that we're Jews, that we're his relatives, that we love him, and dream and yearn to see him. Slowly, he made peace with us, but remained estranged to us for a while. So again, they're Jews, but they look like Arabs, and even their own family members reject them, or in this case, the young child. Now, what were the problems that were unique to children? So talking about babies, first of all, giving birth in these transit camps was extremely difficult. And one of the reasons was that there were no easy roads for to these camps, and so it took a while for the ambulances to arrive, and a lot of women lost their babies. Also, some children died as a result because it took a while for the doctor to arrive there. And you see this in petitions. And the state responded by giving sort of a certain check essentially that was worth something like 3 months of regular wages to women who decided to give birth at home. It didn't work. After birth, there were often no places to put the babies when you're living in tents. And so there are descriptions of women stealing boxes to put the babies in them. Poor health services, few showers. And feeding was a problem. Israel in the 1950s lived under austerity measures. Food was rationed. In the transit camp, sometimes they didn't even provide milk. They provided milk powder. So that was a problem. And you see from reports from doctors this issue of malnutrition, that families can't feed their children.